Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, I'm going to react to what would happen if the USA went bankrupt. I mean, yeah, it has to be one of the most unlikely things to possibly happen. However, it's still possible. But, you know, the US, I imagine the national debt is probably somewhere in the trillions now, like it is for most other developed countries. So, you know, to get to that point of bankruptcy, it would just destroy so much. Like the amount of jobs that depend on US corporations, you know, the people, the effects would be profound. So this video here, I'm hoping is going to really explain, you know, what exactly would happen, the chain of events. So yeah, this is going to be fun. So let's do it.
Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching Top 10's and in the video today, the top 10 things that would happen if the United States went bankrupt. The spectre of the American government declaring bankruptcy gets trotted out particularly often anytime there's a change in the majority party. Because we've been told for decades what a large, scary number America's national debt is, the populace fears that the time when it causes another Great Depression will come any moment. It couldn't even be said to catch us by surprise, since there were many alarmists that would be able to tell us that they told us so. Well, here at Top 10's, we're not alarmists. We're here to tell you what would actually happen in the event of the USA declaring bankruptcy for the first time since 19...
So if the US went bankrupt, would that mean that the US dollar is also pretty much worthless? So would that mean that we would depend on gold, precious metals, like a barter system? Would that be what would happen?
33. And, well, to be honest, the prospect, it isn't very pretty. But we'll also tell you why certain aspects of it, by their nature, ensure it's very unlikely. Certainly, though, stranger things have happened. After all, other nations have experienced it hundreds of times in modern history, and their experiences are the evidence that we will be using for this video. Number 10. Massive shortages across the board. In 2001, Argentina declared bankruptcy brought on by the fact its government had attempted to match the value of its pesos with the US dollar. The impact went far beyond the immediate impact on their currency and their accounts. It meant that gas stations often no longer had fuel to sell. It meant that grocery stores ran out of food. After all, what company would ship goods to regions filled with little to no money, just plenty of desperation? You might be inclined to believe that America is a resource-rich country that can sustain itself off home-produced goods.
Yeah, I would definitely think so. Huge country, ton of farmland, produces oil, you know. What doesn't America produce?
Especially if you have an anti-globalist America First outlook. But America imports vastly more resources than it exports, roughly 50% more, and not for nothing. Considering that bankruptcy also comes with massive inflation, many communities will be full of people whose money no longer has enough value to make sending resources to them worth it for companies. Number 9. Banks will empty out. Back in 1933, during the Great Depression, banks were forced to close as they were reviewed for solvency. As a result, thousands of local banks were closed and savings went with them as patrons rushed to them to draw their money. It is worth noting, however, here that at the time there was an overabundance of banks, so that there was one for every 1,000 people. Since then, we've had a similar event happen in 2008 when the US government had to bail out its largest national banks. However, as of 2016, the Federal Reserve reported that the banks had only grown larger since their bailout nearly a decade earlier. In the event of the government declaring bankruptcy, there will be no one to bail the banks out, so then the closings would be far larger in impact and in terms of lost savings.
Okay, but in a scenario where the US went bankrupt, what exactly would cause it? It would take all of the creditors of the US to demand their money immediately to cause a bankruptcy. Who's going to do that? Like, I can't see a scenario where every single creditor to the US simultaneously demands their money. Because it just doesn't, it would cause such a cyclical devastation. It just wouldn't make any sense.
It would also be a particularly embarrassing case of not being able to learn from a mistake. Number 8. Chinese currency will collapse too. It's scary for many Americans to think that America owes $1.2 trillion to China as of August 2017.
Wow.
Indeed, that was used as a campaign point during the 2016 presidential race. But actually, in a somewhat twisted way, it's the result of a policy that keeps America and China strong. China needs to keep its currency, the yuan, lower than the US dollar because keeping their products affordable in America keeps their manufacturing profitable. Thus, they have a fixed exchange rate with the US dollar. If the US dollar collapses, then the yuan plummets in value in order to continue staying at a fixed rate during American trade, or essentially they'll lose vital demand which keeps their manufacturing centers open. So if you were ever worried that the Chinese government would use this debt leverage to sink the US economy, you can be assured it would only be slightly less suicidal for them than it would be for North Korea to use one of their nuclear weapons. Number 7. Barter economies will be ready. Nothing would help the average person remember that money is merely a medium of exchange with no intrinsic value more than if they suddenly had none and no reliable means of getting it. Such was the fate of much of the American public in 2007 when the nation was rocked by a major recession. What millions of Americans did instead of succumbing to fear was turn to a barter system. According to Reason.com, by January of 2008, Craigslist barter pages had increased 100% in terms of
Wow, so people actually started bartering on a large scale. That's incredible. So people would be like, okay, can I buy this many loaves of bread for, I don't know, a quarter ounce of gold or something like that? Wow, that's crazy. I've always wondered if that's ever been done before.
Of postings and traffic. Now just imagine how much more extreme the financial pressures brought on by a national bankruptcy instead of a recession would be. This was not something that was just done by poor people either. 2007 saw companies and corporations in the United States increase their use of bartering for goods and services by roughly $16 billion. Under these circumstances, people who have stockpiled basic necessities may well make off like bandits or gain considerable influence in their communities for when the economy recovers from the bankruptcy. Number 6. Selling off public property. In Albert Brooks's best-selling novel 2030, he postulates a scenario where, after a particularly devastating earthquake strikes Los Angeles, the USA is too bankrupt to pay to restore the city and has to let Chinese contractors come in and fix it at the cost of Los Angeles becoming a part of China for 50 years. While in real life something that extreme is unlikely, it would certainly not be unprecedented for the federal government to sell off assets for debt, even in relatively recent times. WestCoastBK.com tells us that in the 1990s, this was the reason that a number of military bases in America were closed. Even without selling off the gross domestic product of any cities, the federal government has access to resources.
I don't know. I can't ever see a situation where the US government would allow the sale of Los Angeles to China for that amount of time, just because, you know, the GDP of Los Angeles is enormous. It's absolutely huge. The amount of allies that would, you know, the members of the EU, the UK, you know, that would line up to help the US. I just don't see a scenario where the US would need to agree to that kind of a deal with China, but then again, I could be wrong.
That would more than deal with projected debt. In 2014, it was reported that the US had access to $128 trillion in mineral rights alone, both on land and offshore. The square mileage of that is larger than the entire surface of Canada. Just maintaining all the tens of thousands of underutilized buildings owned by the federal government costs $1.66 billion annually. So if a significant number of those buildings were sold, it would save the government considerably, never mind all the money that could be made from the sales. In short, the federal government has plenty to offer debtors and many ways to tighten its belt if the debt comes due. Number 5. Many will be driven from their homes.
Why?
Despite the ability of the government to likely eventually deal with enormous debt on a national level, in the interim, it would still be able to wreak havoc on even government employees. During the 2013 government shutdown, employees were evicted while on furlough, or even those that were still active, because their pay was suspended and their landlords couldn't wait for them to receive back pay before removing them from their homes. Considering that's what happens to the people that continue to be vital for the government, what fate can the privately employed people people expect? Well, consider this. In a 3-month period following Greece's economic crisis, and despite billions in bailouts, Athens' homeless rate rose roughly 40%, and there was little improvement to the economy years later. For an indication that's closer to home, the Mortgage Bankers Association reported that 1.2 million households were lost to the 2007 American recession. Frankly, it would be amazing if there weren't cities of homeless people.
1.2 million households. That is a lot of people suddenly without a home. As friends and families double up, overcrowding is up 5-fold. This must have created so many homeless people.
For at least a while after the government declares bankruptcy. Number 4, bond lawsuits. It's often forgotten in this turbulent political climate that part of America already has declared bankruptcy, the recently devastated territory of Puerto Rico. Even before it was devastated by Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico was in such massive debt that it sought bankruptcy protections in May of 2017 for its $70 billion debt. One consequence of this was that the US government was sued. This was because it had guaranteed that the bonds that had been issued to people who invested in Puerto Rico back when the Puerto Rican government was doing much better — the downturn essentially began in 2006 when the financial stimulus from the federal government was cut off. So, if America's federal government defaults on the approximately $4 trillion that the government owes to foreign governments other than China, there would be lawsuits that would last long after the economy would be restored. Number 3, demanding money from the World Bank. In the event that the then president and others do not want to risk the humiliation of selling off American land and mineral rights to pay off debt, appeals can be made to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. There certainly won't be any moral objections that the IMF could be expected to express. In February of 2016, for example, the organization was contemplating providing $4 billion to Azerbaijan and $3.5 billion to Nigeria in bailout money, even though the two countries were notorious for corrupt and abusive actions taken to prop up their petroleum industries. By contrast, in 2011, it was reported that the IMF had exerted considerable effort in attempting to persuade developed countries, particularly the United States of America, to give loans to developing countries, even though there was little hope that they would ever see a return on their investments. So naturally, if the IMF wants the developing world to continue developing, it and other nations will very likely be willing to provide some measure of bailout money to the US. Number 2, get away with not.
That makes a lot of sense because, as I mentioned in the earlier in the video, should the US go bankrupt, the cyclical devastation would be huge. So many countries depend on the US. So the US goes down, they all go down, more countries go down, and so on and so on and so on and so on. It could potentially be like a huge black swan event that causes a ton of unforeseen consequences. Like, it would be very bad.
Not paying all debts. Before we get to the grimmest single entry in this video, let's take a break and talk about something that's not so dark, at least as far as the US itself is concerned. Returning to the 2001 Argentinian bankruptcy once more, or more specifically, an act performed by the Argentinian government several years after. With equal amounts gall and savvy, they offered to pay their creditors back 1/3 of the amounts owed in exchange for the forgiveness of all debts. That might seem completely unacceptable, but the thought of getting 1/3 of their money back, even if it meant sacrificing the promise of getting twice as much down the line at some unspecified time, was enough that fully half of all creditors took the deal. Thus, it's quite possible that if, in this hypothetical situation, the American government waits some time, it could persuade its creditors that accepting considerably less than what they were owed would be preferable to making it impossible for the American economy to recover. As a popular saying in the world of finance goes, when you owe the bank $100, you have a problem. When you owe the bank $1 million, they have a problem. Number 1, massive increases in violent crime. Unsurprisingly, newly bankrupt governments have consistently seen massive drops in their security, if for no other reason than that they can't afford their law enforcement. Examples of this in recent time include in 2013 when the 2012 Olympics left Rio de Janeiro bankrupt. What ended up happening was the budget for all forms of security was cut in half and only police salaries were still funded. Now, imagine the impact that could have on DNA tests and other.
So Rio went bankrupt because of the Olympics. I mean, that just seems like negligence to me. Wouldn't you calculate the money that you are likely to receive as a result of the Olympics and then cross-reference that with, your annual budget, you know, like what it costs for you to run the city. How could this happen? Like, I mean, it just seems like poor planning.
Forms of crime scene investigation, as well as airport security or Secret Service protection. Now, add on top of all that the fact that people will be furious because they lost their life savings, anxious behavior because this is a highly unfamiliar situation, and potentially a situation where vital resources such as oil and food won't be accessible. Consider that in 2013, a year after declaring bankruptcy, the city of San Bernardino, California, saw a 50% rise in its homicide rate, and remember the advice City Attorney James Penman gave: lock your doors and load your guns.
What?
So I really hope you found that video interesting.
That was really, really interesting. I mean, the effects were just really profound in just a multitude of areas. It would be so bad for the planet, but I just don't see it ever really happening. It would take decades of really, really, really gross mismanagement. And even then, for the US to go down, for it to be declared bankrupt, I just don't see it happening, man. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.